Hello Year 9 and welcome to Lesson 5 of your English Literature Poetry, focusing on Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney with me, Mr. Smith. Now today's lesson's question is, how is Storm on the Island an exploration of the impact of terrorism in Northern Ireland? Now we've previously talked about this poem as an exploration of the power of nature, and it is that. But Seamus Heaney was also writing about the political and military conflict that he himself lived through in Northern Ireland. And part of today's lesson will be understanding that a poem can contain multiple nested, perhaps hidden meanings, and that it's absolutely possible to look at a poem from multiple angles within an analysis. Now, in order to be able to really engage with the learning today, you need to understand what we mean by conflict. Now, a conflict is a serious disagreement or argument between people with opposing ideas or principles, a fight or a military conflict perhaps. But conflict can arise in all areas of life. There is conflict between humans and nature when we build and it destroys, or when we pollute and cause damage. And there is conflict in terms of physical power, fighting or control over one another. Conflict arises when we have inequality of wealth, when people have lots and others have nothing. And political conflict is something that I think we're probably all familiar with at this point, when opposing viewpoints clash. Love can lead to conflict. Any strong emotion can lead to conflict. We have hate, jealousy, envy. We have heartbreak. All of these things are conflict arising from emotion. And of course, military conflict, the effects of it on those who participate and those who are affected even though they didn't choose to participate. It's also worth going back to remember the dramatic monologue that we covered in previous lessons. And what's really important in this lesson is remembering that this character maybe reveals their inner thoughts and feelings, perhaps without even meaning to. And third of all today is allegory. Again, a familiar one to you, because Bayonet Charge also contained allegorical elements, but a story, poem, picture, or other art form that carries a moral lesson or reveals a truth about human existence is our definition of allegory. And Storm on the Island is probably more allegorical than Bayonet Charge, as it tells this almost parallel story of the impact of terrorism. An example to help you understand and remember what allegory is, think about Christmas Carol. We watch Scrooge move from being a mean and lonely character to a man full of joy and friendship, and that is a moral lesson to Victorian society and of us when we read it as well, that it is good to be generous and charitable and kind. And I want to reintroduce you to Seamus Heaney for a moment before we move on as well, and just remind you of a few things. He was a Northern Irish poet. He grew up in Northern Ireland at the time of the Irish Troubles. And this is what the inspiration for this poem is, as well as the power of nature. His poems are autobiographical, and while this poem particularly isn't about a specific part of his life, it does bring up his experiences and his feelings of being in Northern Ireland and experiencing the conflict, which is something that he was very interested in. The Troubles themselves is the name given to a 3-decade conflict between nationalist and unionist forces in Northern Ireland. And I'm going to give you just the very briefest of facts about this here now. There have been many books written about this, and there are many experts out there who could comment on this far more authoritatively than I ever could. So I simply want you to understand the very briefest information here, and I really would encourage you to, if you're interested, conduct your own research to find out what you can about this period of history. It began in the late 1960s and ended with the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. One of the characteristics of the Troubles were that kidnappings, murders, and the bombings of military and civilian targets took place. So being a soldier put you at risk, but you were equally at risk as a civilian and as an innocent bystander. Seamus Heaney himself actually lost friends and relatives in the Troubles. Some vanished, some were killed in bombings. Some facts for you here: that more than 3,500 people were killed, and of those, over half were civilians. So this was a conflict that had a disproportionate impact on innocent bystanders, and it went on for 30 years. So this was a conflict that people had to live within and make room for in their lives. and try to survive. So it perhaps isn't a surprise that Heaney chose the motif of islanders sheltering from a storm and doing their best to survive a force they can't control or really predict, in order to explore what it felt like to grow up and be around the constant threat of violence that he recognized in his country. So the big idea that we have to think about is the effects of conflict. What types of conflict can exist? How do people respond to danger and uncertainty? So, what do we do? How do we feel when that happens? When we think about what types of conflict exist, we might think about the physical violent conflict, but also maybe emotional conflict and psychological conflict. Are we, as people, powerless in the face of violence? Is there anything that we can do when we are faced with this threat? And what are the long-term effects of living in a state of conflict? Now, we've studied PTSD a little bit when we thought about the soldier in Remains, but what other long-term effects might there be on a population, on a group of people having to live in that state the whole time? And what I'm going to do now is return to my poem and look at the quotations that I'd already picked out for The Power of Nature, and I'm going to look at them again with this question in mind. And once I've done that, I'm actually going to be able to reanalyze those quotations and find the allegory, find the hidden meaning that relates those ideas to the idea of conflict as well as to the power of nature. It's time to actually work on finding the allegorical meanings. So I focused on the same quotations I'd found before because I want to be able to play with both meanings. And I'm going to use the same quotation I chose previously as my example again. So when I look at "we are prepared, we build our houses squat," and I'm thinking not of weather, but of violence and of living in a place where violence is a daily threat, my first idea is that being prepared is about expecting violence and danger after decades of conflict, that these people have grown up knowing that this is something that could happen to them. But of course, later in the poem, they seem much less prepared in the face of this violence, as the islander loses their confidence that the island is a place that is easy to live on. It goes that Ireland, Northern Ireland, was a place where it wasn't easy to live and that you couldn't really prepare for that violence. The image of houses takes on a new meaning now as well, because the war's taking place in their homes, on the streets where they live. There are no safe places here. And the image of these squat buildings now makes me think of military bunkers, as though they're trying to shelter from bullets and bombs, as though these are safe places for them to hide. But are they also maybe figuratively low, as in, like a metaphor? Are they held down by the violence, emotionally and psychologically pushed down low? These extra ideas give the poem a whole new dimension for me. And what you are going to do now is choose two more quotations from your poem, any two that you like, and in the same way that I've done here, find the allegorical meaning. Give yourself 10 minutes, more if you need it, and when that's done, come back for the plenary to finish off our penultimate lesson. Right, welcome back, and here is your plenary, making comparisons, themes, and big ideas. So we've looked at 3 poems in total now: Remains, Bayonet Charge, Storm on the Island. And having looked at this poem in the light of the violence of Ireland, you might find it easier to make some comparisons between themes and big ideas. What I don't want here is any sort of essay or huge long piece of work, but a series of quick notes, maybe a table. Can you come up with maybe 2 or 3 themes that link these 3 poems together? Give it some thought. Don't worry about getting it right, but don't leave this task undone. Use this as a thought experiment. And when you finish with that activity, you'll finish with the lesson, so thank you very much.